I take note of the statement and comments made by the representative of the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine. I'd just like to remind all members that this is a place of respect and decorum. So everyone is reminded to refrain from comments of a personal or disrespectful nature. The representative of Israel has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Mr. Mansour, you can continue with the manipulation and inflation of numbers, but there are facts. And everything I said today, I stand behind it. Your failures in Jenin, your failures in Tulkarem, the weakness of the Palestinian Authority, and I think most importantly is the weakness of your leadership to build a better future for the Palestinian by condemning Hamas. President Abbas was not able to condemn Hamas even once since October 7th. Neither all the ministers in the Palestinian Authority, not one condemnation, and even yourself and your team sitting here preaching, criticizing, but once to condemn the terror of Hamas. The day you will be capable of doing that, you can speak about a future for the Palestinian people. But unfortunately, it's much easier to incite against Israel, to blame us for everything, and without fighting the radicals. And I would advise you, because you are very involved, and I respect that, but look at other countries in the region. When you have leadership which is too weak to confront the radicals, look where they are today. And when you have strong leadership in the Arab countries who are facing the radicals, look the way they have been able to bring their societies. And unfortunately, the way that the Palestinian Authority leadership is going, with the leadership of President Abbas and others and yourself, is to allow the radicals to control the narrative, to allow the radicals to continue with the indoctrination of the next generation. And you know that people are celebrating October 7th, not in Gaza. They are doing it in Ramallah, in Jenin, in Tulkarem. You know, we will defend ourselves, but think about the future of the Palestinian people. Thank you very much, Madam President.
And I also take note of the statement and comments and remind again all members that this is a place of respect and decorum. The representative of the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine has asked the floor to make a further statement. I give him the floor.
And I listen and respect your ruling, but I hope that ruling to be enforced. But be that as it may, those who lecture us about our conduct, and they do not look about the conducts in the streets of Tel Aviv and in other places in Israel, are not the ones who are qualified to lecture us about the conduct of my government. And let me also say, did we hear in this chamber a condemnation of a single behavior of an Israeli leader or officer or a diplomat, of the killing of tens of thousands of Palestinian children and women, and attacks against our people everywhere, including in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank? So those who have such kind of behavior are the least to lecture us here in this chamber about a good conduct and who is an effective government and who is not. Thank you.
The 9,883rd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted.
Madam President, at the outset, we thank Special Coordinator Sigrid Kaag for her reporting, including on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334. Israel believes it has found the solution to the Palestine question, a solution it has often pursued in the past, but never so openly, brazenly, and viciously. the Palestinians will have to choose death in their land or life elsewhere. Instead of ending its occupation, its illegal occupation, it is attempting to end the occupied people. This is evident in the genocide still underway in Gaza to promote the so-called voluntary migration of Palestinians, the code name of mass forcible displacement and transfer of the Palestinian people from their land. But this is also evident in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, in the latest and most massive ethnic cleansing campaign since 1967. This crime is taking place as we speak in the northern part of the West Bank, while all eyes are on the horrific genocide in Gaza. Israel has forcibly displaced, as many of you have indicated, over 40,000 Palestinians in a matter of weeks. It is destroying refugee camps in an attempt to convince Palestine refugees that not only will they not return to their homes, villages, and towns, but that their only horizon is to be displaced time and time again. You can see with your bare eyes destruction and expulsion of entire communities, the physical and violent uprooting of families from their homes and their lands, forced to leave their lives behind. Palestinians have spent decades rebuilding their lives over and over again. And Israel, within days, has destroyed yet again all that they have built. Devastation to achieve displacement. Displacement to achieve annexation. The playbook is well known by now. The crimes fully documented. Madam President, we have said repeatedly, Israel's goal has always been maximum Palestinian land with minimum Palestinians. That it wanted control of Palestinian geography and therefore was attacking Palestinian demography. We said that so many times. Repeating sometimes is useful. While the entire world says there is no alternative to the two-state solution, and we appreciate that all of you keep repeating that, Israel on the ground continues to entertain the deadly illusion that it can destroy the Palestinian people to prevent the self-determination of our people and the independence of our state. The Israeli government is willing to use airstrikes in densely populated neighborhoods, to bulldoze entire camps, and to resort to mass killing, mass detention, and mass displacement to destroy homes and infrastructure, and along with Israeli settlers, to intimidate, assault, and terrorize an entire civilian population to achieve its illegal goals. Now, the question is, what is the world willing to do? To defend its vision, to uphold its laws, to stop this madness. We appreciate your reiteration of commitment to international law, to two-state solution, to the fact that settlements are illegal and should be dismantled. We appreciate that. But that is not sufficient. What are you going to do in order to stop Israel from continuing on this path and to give them a strong injection to wake up and to know that they will not be able to accomplish that objective? What are you going to do? The Israeli plan relies on its assumption that it will not face a decisive international response and clear consequences for its crimes and unlawful actions. So when you reiterate the principles, they take note and they continue with their illegal action. So the reiteration is not sufficient, although it is good. What are you going to do to match your words with deeds, with what is required in order to accomplish the objective of allowing the Palestinian people to exercise their inalienable rights, including their right to self-determination, independence, statehood, and the return of the refugees? Confronted with this unprecedented Israeli escalation, there must be an unprecedented escalation of international measures and response. If you do not escalate your action, concrete action, in upholding international law, defending Security Council resolutions and UN resolution, Israel is not going to change its behavior. So therefore, you have to act. As we were reminded yesterday by the President of the Security Council, and as she reminded us again today. International law is clear. The International Court of Justice advisory opinion is clear. A number of you refer to that. UN resolutions are clear, including Security Council Resolution 2334. And the calls and obligations most recently affirmed in General Assembly Resolution ES-10/24. It is time for implementation. You are absolutely correct, Madam President. You want implementation. This is time for implementation. It is time for accountability. For those who refuse to honor and respect their obligation under the Charter, including implementations of Security Council resolutions, there should be consequences. They cannot belong to this club without abiding by the Constitution and the Charter of this club. You have to honor and respect and implement what we collectively decide. Otherwise, there will be consequences, so that the one that is not respecting the law should face the consequences of such rebellions. Madam President, the Security Council and the General Assembly have called for ending the Israeli illegal occupation for almost 60 years now. They have repeatedly condemned Israelis' settlement activities while witnessing their constant acceleration. They have condemned settlers' violence while each year it reached new heights. They have denounced these actions while witnessing the fragmentation of the Palestinian land, the displacement of the Palestinian people, and the pillage of their natural resources. They have called for upholding the historic status quo at Al-Haram al-Sharif, while Israeli breaches continue and intensify, including during the holy month of Ramadan. The ICJ, in its opinion delivered last year, deemed Israelis' continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, to be unlawful and has called for bringing it to an end as rapidly as possible. It stressed the many Israeli policies and practices that were illegal and called for them to be brought to an immediate end. The Israeli government, so accustomed and addicted to impunity, will not heed these calls and instead continues to demonstrate its contempt for the fundamental rules and institutions of our international law-based order. Israel's aim is to render its illegal colonial occupation irreversible through the forcible displacement of our people and the annexation of our land. It is entrenching its occupation instead of reversing and ending it. The decisions that states are willing to take, individually and collectively, in the coming days and weeks, in support of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, in rejection of the unlawful acquisition of territory by force, and in order to salvage the prospects of shared peace, security, and prosperity in our region, will determine what happens next. Your action will determine what happens next. These measures should be adopted right now, before it is too late. The International Conference for the Peaceful Settlement of the Question of Palestine and the implementation of the two-state solution, to be held in June under the co-chairmanship of Saudi Arabia and France, must be a platform for mobilization and action where states clearly determine how they can correctly contribute to upholding international law, where they will affirm the steps they will take to implement their obligations, including under Resolution 2334, towards bringing an end to the occupation and salvaging peace. This conference is not going to be an ordinary conference where people come, read statements, and a declaration will be adopted and business as usual. No. This is a conference that will be and should be, through the will of all of you, through declaring ahead of time your commitments and obligations of how you can act in order to shorten the life of this illegal occupation in order to accomplish your global consensus on the two-state solution. That's what is needed, and that's what should be done, and that is what will be unfolding with the help of all those who are serious about accomplishing the two-state solution, I believe, very soon at the beginning of next month. These measures should be adopted right now. As I said, I read that. Madam President, the Israeli Minister of War proudly declared days ago, and I quote, 40,000 Palestinians evicted so far. The Jenin, Tulkarem, and Nur Shams refugee camps, now unpopulated. UNRWA activities in the camps was seized. I ordered the Israeli Defense Forces to remain in the cleansed camps for the next year and prevent inhabitants from returning. End of quotation. At the same time, he declared that Israel will advance its plans for annexation of areas of Gaza and continue pushing Palestinians out, terrorizing our people with bombs, evacuation orders, and shocking leaflets aimed to cause fear and panic. Israel's intentions have never been clearer. The international response needs to be equally clear. They cannot be crystal clear in what they want to do, and you are not going to be crystal clear in how you are going to stop it. You have to be crystal clear as well. While Israeli actions are met with worldwide condemnation and rejection, while states have in fact taken a number of measures and initiatives in opposition to these actions, we are far from reaching the necessary threshold to force Israel to revise its plans and calculations. We need to do more to reach the tipping point. We are not there. We need to do more. There is often talk about the need to be realistic. We need to be realistic about what needs to be done to bring us back from the brink. That's what we need to be realistic about. And that entails brave and unprecedented decisions by states to use all the tools available to them to change the course of history, to ensure that the arc of moral universe bends toward justice. I thank you very much, Madam President.
And I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Special Coordinator Kach, for your briefing. Today and yesterday, certain members of this council made an outrageous comparison, one so morally obscene that it must be addressed at the outset. They equated the Israeli hostages held in brutal captivity underground by Hamas with Palestinian terrorists legally arrested by Israel. Let me be clear. The Israeli hostages are innocent men, women, and children, abducted for no reason other than being Israeli or foreigners who were in Israel on October 7th. They are being starved, tortured, and hidden away in Hamas's underground dungeons. In contrast, Palestinians who have been arrested by Israel are terrorists, many with blood on their hands. They have committed the most heinous acts of terror, from cold-blooded murder to producing suicide bombs to planning mass casualty attacks. For the sake of freeing our hostages, we found ourselves in an impossible position, having to release many of these prisoners. Among them were 200 convicted murderers serving life sentences for killing Israelis or Palestinians. But they were convicted. Just because we were forced to exchange murderers for innocence does not mean there is any point of comparison. Do not be mistaken. Anyone who attempts to draw such an equation is intentionally promoting Hamas propaganda. The Palestinian prisoners are fed, clothed, and protected. They have access to legal counsel and the benefit of a robust and independent judiciary that will review their cases without bias. To compare them to hostages is not only an insult to the victims, it is plain moral bankruptcy. We have unfortunately come to expect such bankruptcy from some at this table. Madam President, Israel has returned to war in Gaza. This is not a decision we made lightly, but one that was forced upon us by Hamas. After weeks, we waited for weeks. After weeks of negotiations, after offering to extend the ceasefire in good faith, Hamas refused to release our hostages and continued to stall negotiations. They knew it's Ramadan, they knew it's Passover coming, but they decided to reject all offers. The world watched as Hamas spat in our face and the face of the Israeli people waiting for the return of their loved ones. The world watched as Hamas rejected every opportunity to return 59 innocent men, women, and children home. Israel had no choice but to act. So we are acting decisively. We are striking Hamas targets with precision. In recent days, Israel has eliminated several top Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists. They include Mahmoud Marzouk Ahmad Abu Atfa, responsible for Hamas's internal security forces, Rashid Jihad, head of Hamas's general security forces, and Hassam el-Dalias, head of the Hamas government in Gaza, and a key authority figure. Along with these arch-terrorists, several senior terrorist commanders have also been eliminated. We want our people back. But until Hamas returns our hostages, the destruction of their regime will continue without delay, without pause. Hamas has a choice. They can come back to the table and negotiate, or they can wait and watch their leadership fall one by one. We will not stop until our people come home, all of them. Colleagues, amid all the noise, one fact will forever remain unchanged. Israel will never again tolerate threats to our civilians, from any place, from any group, anywhere. There will be no exceptions. How many times we spoke about Hamas in Gaza and about the threat it poses on our communities? It was ignored. It will not happen again. We will do whatever is necessary to protect our people from Palestinian terrorism, from Houthi terrorism, from Iranian terrorism, from terrorism of any kind. If history has taught us anything, is that the world cannot be trusted to do it for us. We will do it ourselves. The empty words for many of these council members, their deafening silence in the face of terror, have only emboldened those who seek our destruction. The world watched as Hamas turned Gaza into a terror state. I want to remind you, we left Gaza in 2005. Mr. Mansour can tell you what they did to his colleagues. They threw them off the rooftops. They took over Gaza, and we saw what happened there. The world watched as Hamas turned Gaza into a terror state. Israel does not have the luxury of ignorance. We do not have the luxury of waiting for another massacre before acting. And now let's speak about Judea and Samaria. Our actions in Judea and Samaria are essential. In the past 16 months alone, well over 2,000 attempted terror attacks have originated from Judea and Samaria. No one mentioned that. In just the past few months, 46 people have been murdered in terror attacks. No one mentioned that. More than 1,200 others have been injured. This year, innocent lives have already been stolen. Among them, 75-year-old Tamar Edri. Over 100 more have been injured. They are fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters. Entire families torn apart by the same forces that carried out the atrocities of October 7. And these terrorists do not operate in isolation. What is happening in Judea and Samaria is not just an internal security matter. It is another front in Iran's multi-front war against Israel and the Jewish people. But it is also the byproduct of the Palestinian Authorities' stunning incompetence, negligence, and growing irrelevance. And I will elaborate on that later. But let's be clear. The invisible hand behind this chaos is Iran. It is Iran that arms, funds, and directs Hamas and other terror cells in Judea and Samaria, just as it does in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen. It is Iran that has spent years infiltrating Palestinian terrorist organizations, smuggling in weapons, training their operatives, and flooding the region with advanced explosives. Iran has established and maintains Islamist terrorist frameworks in Judea and Samaria through Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It authorizes attacks and transfers millions of dollars every year to support these terrorists, some of whom the Palestinian Authority is also trying to capture. They are trying. For example, Islam Azaiza was arrested not by us, by the Palestinian Authority for its involvement in terror attacks, including against the PA. However, it further came to light that during the interrogation they found out that it wasn't only himself. He had 8 other Palestinian terrorists that were managing funds supplied by Iran to support their terror in Judea and Samaria. Iran's influence does not stop at funding. Through its terrorist mechanisms and proxies, it is attempting to transfer massive quantities of weapons, including munitions, anti-tank weapons, and explosives, into the hands of terrorists. The IDF's operations in Judea and Samaria are focused on disrupting these activities, breaking down terrorist networks, and dismantling Iranian influence before it can spread further. Israel has also intercepted countless shipments of Iranian weaponry, disguised as civilian cargo. But we cannot stop everything. We cannot intercept them all. The world should not pretend that these weapons are for anything other than the slaughter of innocent Israelis. Iran is working tirelessly to turn Judea and Samaria into a second Gaza. They succeeded already. Look what happened to Gaza for 2005. They succeeded. Now they're trying to do the same in Judea and Samaria. But what the Palestinian Authority truly done to stop it? Nothing. This is not for lack of trying, because as Mr. Mansour can tell you, they have tried. The PA has attempted many counter-terrorism operations to dismantle the terror networks entrenched in their backyard. But it has failed. It has been unable to remove the terror groups controlling cities, not streets, not neighborhoods, cities, like Jenin, Tulkarem. Mr. Mansour, we listen very carefully to all of your very long speeches, very patiently. But let's be honest for a moment. Let's talk about the real facts, what's happening in Judea and Samaria. Let's talk about the Palestinian Authority's Jenin operations you conducted in January, not us. The PA, Special Forces, Security Services, I don't know all the names of the organizations, what you did in January in Judea and Samaria. You tried. You managed to arrest 247 terrorists and seize hundreds of weapons in your operations, but utterly failed to disrupt Jenin terrorist operations. You even allowed funds meant for Gaza to be stolen under your watch. Your forces were met in those camps with resentment, distrust, and defiance, not from Israel, but from your own people. They see you as weak, corrupt, and incapable of governance. You have no control over Jenin, Mr. Mansour. You have no control over Tulkarem. Your administration is little more than a figurehead as your authority crumbles. The PA has been unable to govern, unable to provide security, and unable to contain the threat that now faces Israeli civilians. So just as we have seen before, the PA quietly steps aside and leaves the job to us. So we have to go to those camps. We have no desire to go to the camps in Nur Shams, in Jenin, and take care of those threats and terror cells. But we have no other choice, because we know what will happen If we will wait, those terror cells, we will see them in the streets of Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. The choice Israel faces is simple, yet most nations in this room cannot comprehend it. We either act or we wait for another massacre. We either eliminate threats or we wait until those threats take innocent lives. We have tried waiting before, and we will never make that mistake again. There will be no sanctuary for terrorists, not in Judea and Samaria, not in Gaza, not in Lebanon, not anywhere. So let all enemies of Israel, whether in Gaza, Judea and Samaria, Lebanon, Yemen, or Iran, understand this. If you seek to harm our people, we will rise and strike. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Israel for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Jordan.
السيدة الرئيسة.
Madam President, it is my honor to deliver the statement on behalf of the Arab group. Jordan presides over the group for this month. It is also my pleasure to congratulate you on assuming the presidency of the Security Council for this month, wishing you all the success in facilitating the works of this council. I thank the Special Coordinator ad interim, Ms. Sigrid Kaag, for her valuable briefing, particularly in terms of the implementation of Resolution 2334 regarding settlement activities and Israel's violations and unilateral actions that Israel continues to implement across the occupied Palestinian territory. Madam President, our meeting today comes at a critical and extraordinary moment following the important role that Egypt, Qatar, and the US had made in concluding an agreement for a ceasefire and hostage release in Gaza Strip. Israel violated this agreement, which, according to this resolution, 33 hostages were handed over and were returned. If the ceasefire continued, then this would have led to the release of all the hostages and an end of the war against Gaza and its people. However, Israel, it seems like they don't want to stop the war and violated the agreement and resumed its aggression against Gaza and its crimes against the defenseless Palestinian people there. Israel did not stop at stopping the entry of food, electricity, cutting off electricity, but launched a surprise large-scale attack for the first time since the agreement at the early hours of last Tuesday, bombing civilians, the majority of whom are women and children, and killed hundreds of them while they were sleeping, in few hours, while they were sleeping in their tents. The Israeli occupation bears the full responsibility for the repercussions of the violation of the ceasefire agreement, as well as relevant Security Council resolutions, particularly Resolution 2735. We call upon the Council to work on stopping the Israeli war and stop the continued killing and targeting of civilians in Gaza and provide them with protection. In this context, it is imperative for this Security Council and the international community to intensify joint efforts to push Israel to resume the implementation of the ceasefire agreement in the second and third phases of the agreement, and end the collective punishment against civilians in Gaza and open the crossings to humanitarian shelter and medical aid, restore electricity to all Gaza in an adequate and sustainable manner. It is also important to start the implementation of the reconstruction plan of Gaza and restore calm in the West Bank and move forward towards launching a genuine effort that aims at realizing just and comprehensive peace within a specified time frame to ensure the realization of the Palestinian people's aspirations in freedom and an independent state, provide safety and stability to the region and all its peoples. Madam President, The Arab Extraordinary Summit has reaffirmed, this summit that was held in Cairo early this month, reiterated insistence on the option of just, comprehensive, and sustainable peace in settling the Palestinian question and rejecting any efforts and any attempts to displace the Palestinian people from their occupied land or impose unilateral solutions at their account, particularly in terms of their right to self-determination, independent state on the Palestinian national soil in line with international law and relevant Security Council resolutions. In this regard, the Arab group highly appreciates the large-scale international support that rejects the attempts to forcibly displace the Palestinian people from their land. We also welcome the statements of the U.S. President Donald Trump recently that no Palestinians in Gaza would leave the Strip. We reiterate that the early recovery and reconstruction plan for Gaza that was submitted by Egypt in coordination with the State of Palestine and was later endorsed by the Extraordinary Arab Summit is an inclusive Arab plan and comprehensive plan. We appreciate the joint Egyptian-Palestinian efforts to convene an international conference on recovery and reconstruction in Gaza in collaboration with the UN, which is to be held in Cairo soon. We urge the international community, regional and international partners, including international financial institutions, we urge them to actively engage and participate and provide the necessary political and financial support to implement the plans for reconstruction in order to accelerate the efforts to rehabilitate Gaza Strip, reconstructed following the destruction that was caused by the Israeli aggression against Gaza Strip. Madam President, Gaza is witnessing a catastrophic humanitarian situation as a result of the ongoing Israeli war that left tremendous destruction to the infrastructure, to homes, hospitals, schools, vital and UN facilities, in addition to tens of thousands of Gazan families who lost their homes and are now living under very hard and harsh conditions without shelter or the ability to access basic services such as clean water, electricity, and health care. The humanitarian crisis is further exacerbated in light of the ongoing war and siege imposed by Gaza against the Gaza Strip, by Israel against Gaza Strip, that prevents the delivery of humanitarian aid in a systematic manner. The group condemns the banning of entry of humanitarian aid and the cutting of electricity and using starvation as a weapon of war, all of which are grave violations of the basic rules of international humanitarian law, including the Fourth Geneva Convention. We reiterate that the protection of civilians in Gaza is not negotiable and should not be used as a bargaining chip or part of a deal. It is a duty of the occupying power. Madam President, the West Bank and occupied Jerusalem witness also dangerous escalation and tragic conditions as a result of the ongoing Israeli measures, including military incursions into Palestinian cities, the displacement of the population, illegal settlement expansion activities, the demolition of homes, the confiscation of lands, the destruction of infrastructure, and the violation of the sanctity of the holy sites in Al-Quds al-Sharif. The group condemns these measures, including the attempts to forcibly displace Palestinians from their homes or land annexation. This threatens an explosion of situation at all levels and leads to diminishing the opportunities for achieving peace and stability in the region as a whole, in violation of Security Council resolutions, including Resolution 2334 and the ICJ Advisory Opinion of 2024 last July regarding the Israeli occupation of the occupied Palestinian territory. We call upon the international community, and particularly the Security Council, to confront and address the Israeli aggressions and violations in the West Bank and the attacks against Muslim and Christian holy sites in Jerusalem and respect and preserve the historic and legal status quo in these holy sites, particularly during the holy month of Ramadan, including the settlers and Israeli extremist attacks, in order to preserve stability, security, and prevent further explosion of the conditions and the situation. We reiterate the important and pivotal role of UNRWA in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza Strip, and in all its areas of operation, in line with the mandate given to it by the General Assembly and relevant UN resolutions. The Arab group condemns the legislations passed by the Israeli Knesset recently that target UNRWA and its services in the occupied Palestinian territory. We urge the international community to provide political, legal, and financial support to ensure that UNRWA is able to continue its indispensable role. We reiterate the right of Palestinian refugees to return and reparation in line with the relevant UN resolutions. The Arab group condemns the Israeli attacks against the Syrian Arab Republic and the incursions into its territories that is a blatant violation of international law and an aggression on the sovereignty of Syria, as well as a dangerous escalation that will only ignite further tensions and conflict in the region. We call upon the international community and the Security Council to act immediately to implement the international law and oblige Israel to stop its aggression and withdraw from the Syrian territories it occupied in a blatant violation of the 1974 disengagement agreement. The Arab group reiterates that Golan is an occupied Syrian land and reiterates its rejection of Israel's decision to annex the Golan and extend its sovereignty thereon. The group condemns also the Israeli occupation ongoing presence in 5 positions in southern Lebanon and the designation of 2 buffer zones within the Lebanese territories preventing access to them. This is a violation of the sovereignty of Lebanon and Resolution 1701. We reiterate that the Security Council should shoulder its responsibility and oblige Israel to fully withdraw from all the Lebanese territories to the internationally recognized borders in line with Resolution 1701. We warn against of the repercussions of the delay of the withdrawal to stability. We commend the progress in this deployment of the Lebanese army in the area southern of Litani, and we support Lebanon, support its safety, stability, and sovereignty. In conclusion, we call for concerted efforts of the international community to stop the war against Gaza, to allow the entry of aid to the Palestinian people, and stop the Israeli violations throughout the occupied Palestinian territory, to support the steadfastness of the brotherly Palestinian people on their land. We reiterate that we stand with our brothers, the Palestinians, in their efforts to fully obtain their legitimate rights, primarily the right to freedom, an independent, sovereign state on their national soil on the basis of the two-state solution, the Arab Peace Initiative as the only path to achieve comprehensive and sustainable and lasting peace that would guarantee peace, stability for the region as a whole. Thank you, Madam President.
The representative of Jordan for the statement. The permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give him the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. And I'm terribly sorry to take the floor again, but there is a need for a few additional comments. 1 million Palestinians arrested over the last decades are terrorists. 1 million of them. The 10,000 who are still in Israeli jails are terrorists. The children, the teachers, the doctors, the human rights defenders, all terrorists? You consider our people terrorists, all of them, whether from different political groups or factions or NGOs, even the most notable ones, our civilians from before the birth till after their death, all terrorists in your book. These were considered by who? By your military courts, built to subjugate and oppress our people, to enforce illegal military orders that criminalize all civilians by, what is it? Okay, by that civilians, all civilians' actions by Palestinians, including their very existence or their land, and to allow all Israelis' crimes in full impunity. And how many Israelis were held accountable for their crimes against the Palestinian people, from indiscriminate killing to unlawfully stealing our land? How many? Palestinian prisoners are well treated, you claim, including the dozens killed while in custody. Or you mean those beaten, tortured, and raped? Your occupation forces conducted mass arrests of Palestinians, torturing them, then release some of them, disappear some of them, keep in custody and detentions many of them, whether charges exist against them or not. Your courts fail every international standard and have even refused to condemn or charge those responsible for torture. We resorted to international courts and accepted their jurisdiction. You refused to do the same, as your leaders are responsible for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, and you are the spokesperson of this criminal enterprise, and yet want to offer lessons to the world. How many Israeli leaders and members of Israeli occupation forces would be in jail if they were to finally face independent and impartial justice? Many of them, starting with the Israeli Prime Minister, would be in jail. As for your military aggression in all Palestinian cities, it has nothing to do with security and everything to do with your colonial aggression and occupation. Thank you, Madam President.
I take note of the statement and comments made by the representative of the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine. I'd just like to remind all members that this is a place of respect and decorum. So everyone is reminded to refrain from comments of a personal or disrespectful nature. The representative of Israel has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Mr. Mansour, you can continue with the manipulation and inflation of numbers, but there are facts. And everything I said today, I stand behind it. Your failures in Jenin, your failures in Tulkarem, the weakness of the Palestinian Authority, and I think most importantly is the weakness of your leadership to build a better future for the Palestinian by condemning Hamas. President Abbas was not able to condemn Hamas even once since October 7th. Neither all the ministers in the Palestinian Authority, not one condemnation, and even yourself and your team sitting here preaching, criticizing, but once to condemn the terror of Hamas. The day you will be capable of doing that, you can speak about a future for the Palestinian people. But unfortunately, It's much easier to incite against Israel, to blame us for everything, and without fighting the radicals. And I would advise you, because you are very involved, and I respect that, but look at other countries in the region. When you have leadership which is too weak to confront the radicals, look where they are today. And when you have strong leadership in the Arab countries who are facing the radicals, look the way they have been able to bring their societies. And unfortunately, the way that the Palestinian Authority leadership is going, with the leadership of President Abbas and others and yourself, is to allow the radicals to control the narrative, to allow the radicals to continue with the indoctrination of the next generation. And you know that. People are celebrating October 7th, not in Gaza. They are doing it in Ramallah, in Jenin, in Tulkarem. You know, we will defend ourselves, but think about the future of the Palestinian people. Thank you very much, Madam President.
And I also take note of the statement and comments and remind again all members that this is a place of respect and decorum. The representative of the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine has asked the floor to make a further statement. I give him the floor.
And I listen and respect your ruling, but I hope that that ruling to be enforced. But be that as it may, those who lecture us about our conduct, and they do not look about the conducts in the streets of Tel Aviv and in other places in Israel, are not the ones who are qualified to lecture us about the conduct of my government. And let me also say, did we hear in this chamber a condemnation of a single behavior of an Israeli leader or officer or a diplomat, of the killing of tens of thousands of Palestinian children and women, and attacks against our people everywhere, including in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank? So those who have such kind of behavior are the least to lecture us here in this chamber about a good conduct and who is an effective government and who is not. Thank you.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for the statement. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Sigrid Kaag.
Madam President, members of the Security Council, before turning to read the Secretary General's report, I would like to pay homage to my UN colleagues alongside all humanitarian workers in Gaza, be they Palestinian and international. Tragically, on the 19th of March, one UN staff member lost his life. Another 5 UN personnel were injured in strikes at a deconflicted UN site. I grieve with the family of the deceased and wish the injured a speedy recovery. Madam President, I'd also like to express my profound alarm at the resumption of hostilities in Gaza this week, which has already killed hundreds, mostly women and children. And I would like to echo the Secretary General's call for the resumption of serious negotiations for the ceasefire, unimpeded humanitarian access, and for the remaining hostages to be released immediately and unconditionally. Madam President, members of the Security Council, I now turn to the reading of the 33rd report of the Secretary General on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334 of 2016. This report covers the period from the 7th of December to the 13th of March 2025. Security Council Resolution 2334 calls on, and I cite, Israel to immediately and completely cease all settlement activity in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and to fully respect all of its legal obligations in this regard. End citation. Settlement activity has nevertheless continued at a high rate. During the reporting period, Israeli planning authorities advanced or approved approximately 10,600 housing units in settlements in the occupied West Bank, including 4,920 in East Jerusalem. Tenders were announced for approximately 700 units in the area of the Efrat settlement near Bethlehem in the occupied West Bank. Demolitions and seizures of Palestinian-owned structures accelerated across the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Citing the lack of Israeli-issued building permits, which are almost impossible for Palestinians to obtain, Israeli authorities demolished, seized, sealed, or forced people to demolish 460 structures, displacing 576 persons, including 287 children and 149 women. Security Council Resolution 2334 calls, and I cite, for immediate steps to prevent all acts of violence against civilians, including acts of terror, as well as all acts of provocation and destruction. End citation. Unfortunately, the high number of fatal incidents across the occupied Palestinian territory and Israel precludes from detailing all. Madam President, in Gaza, according to the Gaza Ministry of Health, at least 1,897 Palestinians were killed, and at least 5,979 were injured during the reporting period. According to Israeli sources, 59 hostages are still alive, being held captive. 251 hostages were abducted on the 7th of October by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups. Israeli sources also report 30 Israel Defense Forces soldiers killed and at least 3 injured during the reporting period. From 7th of December until the ceasefire and hostage release deal took effect on 19th of January, hostilities in Gaza continued, resulting in high numbers of Palestinian casualties, continued massive displacement of civilians, and widespread destruction, including to civilian infrastructure. Palestinian armed groups continued to hold hostages in horrific conditions and fired rockets indiscriminately towards Israel. Since the ceasefire took effect on the 19th of January, 25 Israeli and 5 Thai nationals have been released by Hamas and other armed groups, as well as the remains of 8 hostages who were killed on 7th of October or whilst in captivity, amongst them 2 children. Released hostages have described or exhibited signs of serious ill treatment. During the reporting period, 1,777 Palestinian prisoners and detainees were released by Israel. Some reported serious ill treatment, sexual abuse, and humiliation during detention. In the reporting period, at least 21 UN personnel were killed in Gaza. Meanwhile, violence in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, continued at alarming levels. 123 Palestinians, including 6 women and 19 children, were killed during ISF airstrikes, operations, armed exchanges, demonstrations, and other incidents. Most Palestinians were killed in the context of Israeli operations in Area A, including during exchanges of fire with armed Palestinians. 924 Palestinians, including 220 children, were injured by the ISF, including 361 by tear gas inhalation and 299 by live ammunition. 117 Palestinians, including 6 children, were injured by settlers. Madam President, according to Israeli sources, 10 Israelis, including 2 children and 3 women, and 5 security services personnel were killed, and another 96, including at least 3 children and 10 women, and 32 ISF personnel were injured by Palestinians in shooting, stabbing, and ramming attacks and other incidents. The ISF arrested 1,711 Palestinians during operations in the occupied West Bank. Israel currently holds at least 9,406 Palestinians, including 3,405 in administrative detention, according to the Israeli Prison Service. On the 19th of February, Israel's military advocate general indicted 5 IDF reservists for serious abuse, including sexual abuse of a Palestinian detainee on the Sdei Teiman facility. On 17th of January, a Palestinian security forces operation that began on the 5th of December against armed groups in the Jenin refugee camp ended with 16 Palestinians killed, including 6 PSF personnel. On the 21st of January, Israel's largest operation in the occupied West Bank since 2002 began and has since expanded across the northern West Bank in what Israeli authorities described as a counter-terrorism operation. This has included the continued use of airstrikes and the deployment of tanks for the first time since 2002, and the demolition of residential buildings and civilian infrastructure and displacing 40,000 people. On the 9th of February, Israeli operations expanded into Nur Shams camp in Tulkarem, where IDF soldiers shot and killed 2 Palestinian women, one of whom was pregnant. 2 Palestinian children were killed by Israeli soldiers in separate incidents in Jenin and Hebron on 21st of February, bringing the total number of children killed to 8 across the occupied West Bank since the operation began. The IDF demolished 23 residential buildings in Jenin refugee camp on the 2nd of February and another 14 in Tulkarem refugee camp on 18th of February, stating it was targeting terrorist infrastructure. The Jenin, Tulkarem and Nur Shams refugee camps have been nearly emptied of their residents. The IDF has also expanded widespread movement restrictions across the occupied West Bank since the 21st of January, including access to essential services and economic activity. On the 23rd of February, the Israeli government stated that the IDF will remain in some of the refugee camps for the coming year and that their residents will not be able to return. Settler-related violence continued throughout the reporting period. Between the 15th and 20th of January alone, for example, large groups of Israeli settlers attacked 11 Palestinian towns and villages across the occupied West Bank, injuring 17 Palestinians, including 2 children, and damaging property. Palestinian attacks against Israelis also continued. In Palestinian shooting attacks on vehicles on the occupied West Bank, a 10-year-old Israeli child was killed and 3 Israelis injured on 11th of December. And 2 elderly Israeli women and 1 policeman were killed and 8 people injured on the 6th of January. Madam President, the Security Council, in its resolution 2334, called upon both parties to refrain from provocative actions, incitement, and inflammatory rhetoric. Unfortunately, such acts have continued. Hamas officials continue to call for violence and attacks against Israelis and encourage escalation throughout the occupied West Bank. Palestinian officials, social media, and media channels continue to glorify the perpetrators of attacks against Israelis. Senior Israeli officials continue to call for the displacement of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, a return to full-scale war, and re-establishment of settlements in Gaza. 2 ministers called on the prime ministers to, citation, open the gates of hell, end of citation, on Gaza if all hostages are not released, taking over the entire strip, removing its population, and cutting off electricity, water, and humanitarian assistance. Some Israeli officials continue to call for the annexation of all or parts of the occupied West Bank. Madam President, Resolution 2334 reiterated calls by the Middle East Quartet for affirmative steps to be taken immediately to reverse negative trends on the ground that are imperiling the 2-state solution. End of citation. When the ceasefire came into force on the 19th of January, the surge in the entry of supplies into Gaza and improved access enabled expanded delivery of life-saving assistance and services across Gaza by UN agencies and other humanitarian actors. Over 57,000 metric tons of food was brought into the Gaza Strip in the first month, and more than 1.9 million people have received food parcels since the ceasefire began. However, since the 2nd of March, the entry of all humanitarian and commercial supplies into Gaza have been halted by the Israeli authorities, severely impacting humanitarian operations. Israel has also cut power to southern Gaza's desalination plant, limiting clean water access for 600,000 people. On the 1st of February, medical evacuations started through Rafah crossing into Egypt. According to the WHO, between 12,000 and 14,000 people, including over 4,500 children, remain in urgent need of medical evacuation. On the 18th of February, the World Bank, the UN, and the EU, in consultation with the Palestinian Authority, released the interim rapid damage and needs assessment report for Gaza and the occupied West Bank. This estimated 53.2 billion is needed over the next decade, primarily for Gaza. On the 30th of January, Israeli legislation that seeks to prevent UNRWA from operating in the territory that Israel regards as being part of the State of Israel, which includes East Jerusalem, came into effect. On 18th of February, Israeli forces and municipality personnel forcefully entered the UNRWA Kalandia training center in East Jerusalem, fired tear gas and sound bombs in its vicinity, and ordered its immediate evacuation, impacting at least 350 students and 30 staff members. Israeli police officers also went to several UNRWA schools in occupied East Jerusalem and ordered their closure. The PA's financial situation remains precarious. On the 12th of January, the Israeli Minister of Finance announced the full repayment of debt it claims was owed by the PA to the Israeli Electric Company by transferring 550 million of the 1.2 billion of Palestinian clearance revenues that Israel has withheld from the PA since October 2023. President Abbas issued a decree on 10th of February cancelling payments by the PA to families of Palestinians killed during or imprisoned following attacks on Israelis. The decree specified that social welfare support based on need will be provided to families through a separate entity. Madam President, in Resolution 2334, the Security Council also called upon all states, and I quote, to distinguish in their relevant dealings between the territory of the State of Israel and the territories occupied since 1967, end citation. No new steps are known to have been taken in the reporting period. Resolution 2334 also called upon, I quote, all parties to continue inter alia to exert collective efforts to launch credible negotiations on all final status issues in the Middle East peace process, end quote. On 19th of January and 17th of February, the third and fourth meeting of the Global Alliance for the Implementation of the Two-State Solution were held in Oslo and Cairo, respectively. The meetings continue to advance efforts towards the implementation of the two-state solution while supporting the ceasefire and hostage release deal. On March 4th, Egypt hosted an emergency summit of the League of Arab States, which endorsed the Arab Islamic Gaza reconstruction plan prepared by Egypt and the Palestinian Authority. Madam President, in closing, allow me to share the Secretary General's observations on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334. 1. The Secretary General once again strongly condemns the horrific acts of terror by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups on the 7th of October 2023 and the continued holding of hostages in Gaza. Hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. The Secretary General also condemns the reported ill treatment of hostages, as well as the fact that there are reasonable grounds to believe the hostages may be subjected to sexual violence and abuse. The Secretary General also reiterates his condemnation of Hamas' abhorrent public displays accompanying the release of living and deceased hostages. While in captivity, hostages must be treated humanely and allowed to receive assistance from the International Committee of the Red Cross. 2. The Secretary General again unequivocally condemns the widespread killing and injury of civilians and the destruction of civilian infrastructure in Gaza. Nothing can justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. He mourns UN staff killed in Gaza and strongly condemns the killing of all humanitarian personnel. The Secretary General reiterates his call for the full investigation of all such incidents and accountability for any violations of international law that may have been committed. He also strongly condemns the reported ill treatment, including sexual abuse of Palestinian prisoners and detainees in Israeli detention facilities, and recalls that their release must also be carried out in a dignified manner. He stresses the importance of ensuring the humane treatment of all individuals deprived of their liberty, including freedom from any form of torture and abuse. 3. The Secretary General also condemns indiscriminate attacks and the use of human shields, which are prohibited by international humanitarian law. He urges all parties to respect their obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. 4. The Secretary General reiterates his call for a sustained ceasefire and urges the parties to redouble efforts to end human suffering. He commends the efforts of the mediators, Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, to facilitate the implementation of the deal in full, as well as concerted international efforts, including in the region, to support an end to the war and plan for recovery and reconstruction of Gaza. He rejects the forced displacement of the Palestinian population from any part of the occupied Palestinian territory, which would constitute a grave violation of international human rights and humanitarian law. The Secretary General strongly rejects any form of ethnic cleansing. 5. The Secretary General is appalled at the horrific humanitarian situation. Humanitarian aid is not negotiable. While the surge in humanitarian aid has been crucial to saving lives in Gaza, the humanitarian situation remains catastrophic. The UN has proven that with access, the coordinated response can deliver aid people need. The Secretary General strongly condemns the halting of humanitarian assistance into Gaza by Israeli authorities and urges the immediate resumption of humanitarian and commercial deliveries. 6. The escalation of violence in the occupied West Bank is deeply troubling. Alongside the rising death toll, Palestine refugee camps in the northern West Bank are being emptied and are sustaining massive infrastructural damage during Israeli operations. The number of displaced Palestinians continues to rise, and residents continue to be denied the right to return home. The Secretary General is deeply concerned by any long-term presence of Israeli security forces in the camps, which would further undermine the Palestinian Authority and be contrary to Israel's obligation to end its unlawful continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, as affirmed by the International Court of Justice. 7. The Secretary General urges security forces to exercise maximum restraint and use lethal force only when it's strictly unavoidable to protect life. He strongly condemns all acts of violence against civilians, including acts of terror. The Secretary General is alarmed by the lethal attacks carried out by Israeli settlers against Palestinians, including sometimes in the proximity and with the support of the Israeli security forces, as well as by Palestinians against Israelis. All perpetrators must be held accountable. The continued use of heavy weaponry in the occupied West Bank, including in residential areas, is extremely concerning. The Secretary General also recalls that Israel, as the occupying power, has a responsibility to ensure that the civilian population is protected against all acts of violence. The relentless expansion of Israeli settlements, 8, is dramatically altering the landscape and demographics of the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Palestinians are increasingly confined into shrinking and disconnected areas, presenting an existential threat to the prospect of a contiguous, viable, independent Palestinian state. The Secretary General reiterates that settlements have no legal validity and constitute a flagrant violation of international law. The demolition and seizure of Palestinian-owned structures entail numerous human rights violations and raise concerns about the risk of forcible transfer. The Secretary General once again urges the government of Israel to abide by its obligation under international law and recall the finding by the International Court of Justice in its advisory opinion of 19th of July 2024, which declared inter alia that the State of Israel is under an obligation to cease immediately all new settlement activities and to evacuate all settlers from the occupied Palestinian territory. 9. The Secretary General reiterates his call to the parties for the status quo at the holy sites in Jerusalem to be respected and upheld, taking into account the special and historic role of Jordan. 10. The implementation of 2 Knesset laws concerning UNRWA could dramatically hinder efforts to ease human suffering. The Secretary General reiterates there is no alternative to UNRWA. He condemns the breach of the inviolability of the United Nations premises in the occupied Palestinian territory and the attempt to forcibly enter UNRWA schools and to seek their closure. National legislation cannot alter Israel's obligation under international law. 11. The Secretary General welcomes ongoing efforts by regional countries, international partners, and the Palestinian Authority to plan for Gaza's reconstruction, including the Gaza Reconstruction Plan endorsed by and at the Arab League Organization of Islamic Cooperation. The UN will continue to work closely with the Palestinian Authority and all stakeholders to ensure a future for Gaza that provides for protection, recovery, and reconstruction for Palestinians to remain in Gaza, and security for Israel. This will require establishing appropriate security and governance frameworks. Gaza and the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, must be treated as one, politically, economically, and administratively. 12, we must work collectively to establish a political framework that outlines tangible, irreversible, and time-bound steps. The occupation must end as rapidly as possible. A viable two-state solution, Israel and Palestine, of which Gaza is an integral part, living side by side in peace and security, on the basis of United Nations resolutions, previous agreements, and international law, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states, is long overdue. The United Nations will continue to support all efforts towards that goal. End of reading. Thank you.
I thank Special Coordinator Kaag for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you, Coordinator Sigrid Kaag, for your briefing. As the United States has consistently said, the future of the Middle East must look different. Fresh thinking is needed for a better tomorrow for Israelis and Palestinians alike. The stated purpose of this meeting is to report on the implementation of Resolution 2334, the passage of which was a mistake and whose ongoing discussion is a distraction from the real threats to international peace and security. Indeed, it is an impediment to this Council's work to address them. Hamas bears full responsibility for the ongoing war in Gaza and for the resumption of hostilities. Every death would have been avoided had Hamas accepted the bridge proposal that the United States offered last Wednesday. Hamas continues to hold 59 hostages captive, including 5 Americans. They must be returned to their families immediately. President, colleagues, no country would willingly allow terrorist groups to threaten its people, and Israel is no different. Israel has the right to defend itself from groups that wish to do it harm. As it relates to the West Bank, the United States supports the efforts of the Israel Defense Forces and the Palestinian Authority security forces to root out violent extremists in Jenin and Tulkarem. We welcome the announcement by the Palestinian Authority that it will end the practice of offering cash payments to the families of those who carry out terrorist attacks, which for far too long has incentivized violence against Israeli civilians and set back the prospects of peace. The time for half measures and false promises to end this abhorrent practice has passed. Hamas has steadfastly refused all attempts to extend the ceasefire in recent weeks, including the bridge proposal that would have provided calm beyond Ramadan and Passover and allowed time to negotiate a framework for a permanent ceasefire. President Trump has made clear that Hamas must release the hostages immediately, or there will be hell to pay. That is non-negotiable. The pillars of America's approach remain resolute: stand with Israel and stand for peace. We recognize ongoing efforts by the IDF to prevent civilian harm. It has been more than 17 months since Hamas started this horrific conflict, upending so many lives and causing such great suffering across the region. The United States calls on the United Nations, and particularly Secretary General Guterres, to join us in putting pressure on Hamas to end the bloodshed and put down its arms. Calls for both sides to respect the ceasefire display a false equivalency that is counterproductive. They fail to acknowledge that Hamas is guilty of rejecting proposals to extend the ceasefire, and they ignore the reality that Hamas must disarm and play no role in the future of Gaza. The United States offers condolences to the family of the UN staffer who was killed on Wednesday in Gaza, and we welcome Israel's investigation into the incident. We also note that far too long, Hamas has misused UN facilities for far too long, and it is important for the UN to speak out about these repeated violations. We expect all parties to comply with international humanitarian law. We recognize Egypt and Qatar's interest in mediating negotiations, and we look forward to continued discussions with Arab partners on the future of Gaza without Hamas. Madam President, we need bold thinking to avoid making the same mistakes in the West Bank, Gaza, and further afield. In 2017, President Trump recognized the reality that Jerusalem is Israel's capital, and several other countries did the same. It is time for new thinking on Gaza as well, so Gazans and the region may enjoy security and prosper. But we must also acknowledge that the Middle East continues to suffer from violence and instability fueled by Iran and the terrorist proxies it funds, such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. The weakening of terrorist groups such as Hamas and Hezbollah provide the countries of the Middle East an opportunity to reshape their region in a way that affords all its people a better path forward. Stronger ties between Israel and its neighbors and an expansion of the Abraham Accords offer an alternative to Iran's malign influence and state sponsorship of terror. We cannot tolerate a nuclear weapons-capable Iran that funds the destruction and destabilizing terrorism plaguing the region and beyond. But the Islamic regime is capable of ending these conflicts. Just as Hamas could end the war today, this moment, by releasing the hostages and laying down its arms, Iran could choose to join the community of nations by ending its support for terrorist proxy groups and providing transparency on its nuclear program that the global community has consistently demanded. The United States will do its part and is committed to working with our Arab partners and Israel to create a brighter future for all of the region's people. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement.
Thank you, Madam President. France thanks the Special Coordinator for her report. The picture is bleak. Almost 10 years after the adoption of Resolution 2334, that is a benchmark resolution, a landmark resolution, in our view, everything or almost everything has worsened in the region and the catastrophe seems to know no end. Our Council has had an opportunity to discuss this situation yesterday and the day before yesterday. At least we've discussed two of the dimensions, the most tragic ones, the harrowing fate of the Israeli hostages held by Hamas since the 7th of October 2023, and the fate of the people of Gaza since the beginning of the Israeli military offensive. France's position is well known, and I will sum it up here in a few words. Nothing can justify the terrorist attacks committed on the 7th of October. France condemns them absolutely. As President Macron has said on a number of occasions, Israel has the right to self-defense, but with respect for IHL and aware of the fact that there is no military solution in Gaza. The January agreement provided a prospect with its three phases, including the ceasefire, the release of all hostages, the resumption of humanitarian aid, and commitment to a discussion about the future. 42 days where we held this promise for change since the resumption of the blockade on humanitarian aid by Israel and the beginning of a new campaign of massive shelling. Once again, terror and death reign in Gaza. The reason invoked by Israel to justify this does not hold water, and delays in the release of hostages cannot justify the punishment of an entire people. We call, therefore, once again for the release of all hostages in dignity and the return of the bodies of the deceased. Hamas must spare the world from this very dark, bleak picture and the situation it has subjected the unfortunate hostages to. Who wins in this situation by showing such contempt for life? We call on the Israeli government to resume without condition humanitarian aid, to cease shelling, and to hold to the negotiations, however slow they are, and to stop responding to cruelty by unleashing violence. For our part, we stand side by side with the US, Qatar, and Egypt, working tirelessly to obtain from Hamas the release of the hostages and calling upon Israel to return to the process from January. But, Madam President, the Council must not turn a blind eye to the other reality pointed out in Ms. Kaag's report, pursuant to Resolution 2334. In rereading the text, more specifically the operational paragraphs with regard to the current Israeli policies, in doing that, we see how far off the mark we are. Settlements in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank are ongoing. They are being ramped up and they are becoming increasingly violent, and they are taking place with the active participation of the Israeli security forces. We have the law. It has been reaffirmed by the ICJ in its advisory opinion on the 19th of July. Israel must cease all settlement activity in the occupied territories because it is illegal. An occupying power, Israel has the right or the duty to halt violence carried out by extremist settlers and to protect Palestinian civilians, to preserve the historic status quo over the holy sites. In short, to halt anything that relates to de facto annexation of the occupied Palestinian territories. Minister Barrot said this today. France is opposed to any form of annexation, be it in the West Bank or in Gaza. But the law requires it, but so does political logic. The spiral of violence which has been set in motion since the 7th of October is the culmination of a progressive worsening over the past few years. It has simply destroyed the lives of innocent civilians. It is fueling hatred on all sides, and it is taking us further away from the prospects of peace. Who can reasonably think that an agreed solution will emerge from this nightmare? Who can believe that a negotiated solution between Israelis and Palestinians can be brought about if their minds are still prisoners of this cycle of violence? For that reason, for months, France has been working with all countries, the Arab countries first and foremost, to find a mechanism and to use the ceasefire pursuant to the January terms as a starting point for resuming dialogue. The International Two-State Solution Conference, called for by the General Assembly on the 3rd of December, was done so by an overwhelming majority. With Saudi Arabia, France is working actively to prepare for it. And we do place a great deal of hope in the conference for the reconstruction of Gaza, which is being prepared by Egypt and the Arab League. Finally, Madam, it is our duty as the Council to reaffirm that the agreements must be respected. France is quite concerned that 2 French citizens employed by the United Nations were seriously wounded following the strikes. And we extend our condolences to the UN, to our victims, and to their families. And it recalls that the facilities and personnel of the UN must absolutely be protected against attacks. Moreover, France calls for a cessation of baseless allegations according to which the United Nations, its organizations and agencies are not carrying out their mission to protect the most vulnerable, to reaffirm law, to provide relief to victims, to condemn acts of terrorism or violations of human rights. The UN is carrying out its mission. The staff are doing what they can, quite often at the cost of their own lives. Let us make sure that these sacrificed victims, Israelis, Palestinians, and UN workers, will not have been in vain. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of China.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Special Coordinator Kaag for her briefing. I'd like to comment through you the position of the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres on the Palestinian-Israeli issue. The resumed fighting in Gaza has sparked widespread concern and apprehension in the international community. Since 17th March, Israel has carried out large-scale airstrikes, renewed its ground offensive, and occupied central Gaza. Israel has also cut off access to humanitarian supplies and electricity in succession, causing massive loss of lives and worsening the already grave humanitarian disaster. China is gravely concerned about the breakdown of the hard-won ceasefire. The stark contrast between the 15-month-long bloody conflict and the 42-day ceasefire speaks volumes, Resuming the fighting is not the right way to bring back hostages. It only results in more killings. Securing a durable ceasefire is the best way to save lives and bring hostages home, and it is an overriding priority. We urge Israel to abandon its obsession with the use of force, immediately cease its military operations against Gaza, and lift blockade on the access of humanitarian supplies to Gaza. It is hoped that the guarantors of the ceasefire agreement will act impartially and responsibly to promote consistent implementation of the three-phase ceasefire agreement in order to achieve a durable ceasefire in Gaza. With Gaza in flames of war, the situation in the West Bank is equally critical. Over the past year or so, Israel has been expanding its settlements in the West Bank on a massive scale, demolishing a large number of Palestinian homes and condoning settler violence. In particular, over the past 2 months, continued Israeli military operations have emptied by force multiple refugee camps, displacing over 40,000 people. Settlement activities violate international law and Council Resolution 2334. Israel should cease its attacks on the West Bank, stop settler activities, and effectively curb settler violence. China wishes to reiterate that implementing the two-state solution is the only viable way to resolve the Palestinian issue. The international community should step up its efforts to promote political process of the two-state solution and provide it with robust guarantees. China supports the Gaza Recovery and Reconstruction Plan jointly initiated by Egypt and other Arab states, and supports the commencement of rebuilding in accordance with the principle of Palestinians governing Palestine. China opposes the forced removal of Palestinian people. We oppose any attempt to annex the West Bank and Gaza and other territories. President, elsewhere in the Middle East, tensions are also rising. Peace and stability are still in peril. Israeli forces have occupied 5 locations in southern Lebanon, flouting Council Resolution 1701, violating Lebanese sovereignty and territorial integrity. Israel's recent frequent airstrikes against Syria have also violated Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity. China urges Israel to withdraw from Syria and Lebanon without delay. The political transition in Syria is at a critical stage. The Syrian authorities are responsible for ensuring the inclusiveness of the political process and effective fulfillment of their obligations under international law, including counterterrorism obligations. China expresses concern over the renewed escalation in Yemen and the Red Sea and calls on the country concerned to stop their airstrikes against Yemen and to respect in earnest Yemen's sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity. The Houthis should stop any attacks against and harassment of commercial vessels and maintain safe routes of navigation in the Red Sea. The Iranian nuclear issue has once again come to a critical crossroads. A proper handling of the Iranian nuclear issue is crucial to peace and stability in the Middle East. History and reality have once again, time and again, proven the futility of sanction, pressure, and the threat of force. Only dialogue and consultation provides the right way forward. March the 14th saw a successful Beijing meeting between China, Russia, and Iran on the Iranian nuclear issue. A joint statement was issued. Foreign Minister Wang Yi, during his meeting with the representatives of Russia and Iran, put forward China's 5-point proposition on the proper settlement of the Iranian nuclear issue in the new context, calling for adherence to peaceful settlement of disputes through political and diplomatic means, the creation of conditions for the resumption of dialogue, negotiation, and cautioning against any action that may escalate the situation. China stands ready to work with all parties for a just, balanced, and sustainable solution to the Iranian nuclear issue. uphold the international nuclear non-proliferation regime, and promote international and regional peace and stability. In conclusion, I wish to reiterate that the question of Palestine is at the core of the Middle East problem. Gaza must not become a battleground for political game. Civilian lives must not be sacrificed to political calculations. A durable ceasefire must be realized in Gaza. A lasting ceasefire must be realized in Gaza. China supports all necessary action by the Council to this end. Thank you, President.
I thank Special Coordinator Karg for her briefing. We welcome this opportunity to discuss the evolving situation in the occupied Palestinian territories. And first, I'll address recent developments in Gaza. This week saw more bloodshed return to the Gaza Strip. It is appalling that hundreds of Palestinians have been killed following Israeli strikes since the 18th of March. We strongly oppose Israel's resumption of hostilities. Escalation and endless violence is in nobody's interests. We are outraged that a UN compound in Gaza was hit on Wednesday morning. Our thoughts are with the victims and their families. There must be a full investigation into what happened. We urge all parties to return to dialogue and to implement the ceasefire agreement in full. This must include the return of the 59 hostages who've been cruelly held by Hamas for over 500 days. As we said in the Council yesterday, Hamas must be held accountable for their depraved actions. We also call on Israel to immediately restore humanitarian access and electricity to Gaza. Refusing to do so risks breaching international humanitarian law. Second, President, we must look to the future and redouble our efforts to secure long-term peace for Israelis and Palestinians. This means a credible plan to allow Palestinians in Gaza to return home and rebuild their lives, with Hamas removed from power. To be clear, we oppose any attempt to forcibly annex land in Gaza. We welcome the Arab initiative of a recovery and reconstruction plan for Gaza, and we urge all parties to engage constructively with it. Sustainable peace also means addressing worrying developments in the West Bank. We are seriously concerned by the scale of the Israeli military operation in the West Bank and the displacement of nearly 40,000 Palestinian refugees. We recognize Israel's right to self-defense, but civilians must be protected, and Israel must ensure its operations are proportionate to the threat posed. Israel must halt settlements which are illegal and undermine the viability of a Palestinian state and the security of both Israelis and Palestinians. The violent settlers must be held to account. The UK has introduced 3 rounds of sanctions on violent settlers and their supporters to bring accountability for abuses of human rights, in the absence of sufficient Israeli action. We will consider all further options. Reports of the killing of Palestinian civilians in the West Bank, including children, are abhorrent. The IDF must take all precautions to prevent civilian deaths, and must investigate civilian deaths thoroughly and demonstrate full accountability to the law. The level of restrictions on Palestinian movement in the West Bank are crippling. These only fuel further instability. It is important, especially during the month of Ramadan, that religious freedoms are respected. Restrictive visa and registration processes are also deeply concerning. Israel must ensure the UN, including UNRWA, can provide essential humanitarian and service delivery in a safe and secure environment. President, 17 months on from the dreadful attacks of 7 October, We urge all parties to implement the ceasefire agreement in full and to work towards a two-state solution with a safe and secure Israel alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. This is the best way to deliver a peaceful future for Israelis and Palestinians alike. I thank you.
I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Denmark. I would like to start by thanking Special Coordinator Kark for your very detailed and insightful report. Denmark deplores the breakdown of the ceasefire and the subsequent resumption of the Israeli airstrikes and renewed ground operations in Gaza, with further devastation for the civilian population. We deeply regret the death of a UNRWA staff member and 5 UNRWA staff, and echo the Secretary General's condemnation of all attacks on UN personnel. Denmark stands firm in our calls for the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages and for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. We call on Israel to live up to its obligations under international law, including the resumption of unimpeded entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza. Colleagues, in December 2016, this Council came together to adopt Resolution 2334. That decision, born of the collective and urgent desire to further the two-state solution, offered hope. Hope for a just and lasting peace for Israelis and Palestinians alike. Today, more than 8 years later, the path to a two-state solution is threatened more than ever. It is threatened in particular by 4 compounding and converging developments. Firstly, the conflict brought on by Hamas terror attack on October 7th and the divisions it has deepened. Second, the largest displacement of civilians in the West Bank since 1967, a result of the security situation and the Israeli military operations in the northern West Banks. Third, a weakening of the 2 pillars of stability in the West Bank, UNRWA and the Palestinian Authority. And finally, the topic of today's briefing, settlements. And let there be no doubt, settlements, which are in clear violation of international law, also undermine prospects for a two-state solution. The development robs Palestinians of their land, pushes them into isolated enclaves, making it virtually impossible to form a connected and viable land for a future Palestinian state. In 2024, we saw a more rapid expansion of settlements in the West Bank than ever before. This includes the establishment of more than 50 new outposts, 8 of these in Area B, the first establishment in this area since the Oslo Accords. Reading these reports of zones, area classifications, and constructions, it can almost sound like a technical issue. But in fact, settlements cause serious, lasting hardship and suffering. The reality is, Palestinian families are ordered from their land. They are left watching as their homes are demolished. They may return again during the night to rebuild their homes, only to see them demolished again. These families are then faced with an impossible choice: stay and tolerate the intolerable, or leave and permanently lose their land. We once again call on Israel to immediately halt all settlement expansion on Palestinian land. Any unilateral attempt to change the demography of the occupied Palestinian territories is unacceptable and constitutes a clear violation of international law. According to the ICJ, policies, practices, or other measures that seek to bring the occupied territory under Israel's permanent control constitute acts of annexation contrary to international law. Some settlements come about through settler violence, in which we have seen an alarming escalation with very little accountability. We are deeply concerned by reports that the Israeli military often cooperates with settlers, including by sending troops to escort settlers and sometimes joining in effects to expel Palestinian residents. This is unacceptable, and it must stop now. We remind Israel of its responsibility as the occupying power for abuses committed by security forces as well as its nationals. We call on Israel to hold these settlers to account. In the European Union, we have imposed sanctions on extremist settlers. International scrutiny of these violations continues to be hindered if the UN system and other actors are refused visas and thereby unable to exercise their functions, including independent reporting. Colleagues, let me be clear. Denmark remains firmly committed to Israel's security. This is why we cannot let the two-state solution disappear before our eyes. We have the frameworks. What is needed is implementation. Full implementation of Resolution 2334 and other relevant resolutions. full respect for the advisory opinions of the ICJ, a resumption of the ceasefire and release of all hostages, reform and revitalization of the Palestinian Authority. In short, we need to create the conditions for the realization of the two-state solution. Israelis and Palestinians deserve a just and lasting peace now. Around this table, we must do everything in our power to support that. I resume my functions now as President of the Council.
Government and who is not. Thank you.
I thank the permanent observer of the State of Palestine for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite Council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on this subject. The meeting is adjourned.